Thank you very much, dear Leslie, dear Omar, and dear interdisciplinary seminar, Cooper Union team, for this generous invitation and for having me here today. It's an honor for me to speak here and to discuss with you the ways with which military authorities moved from counter-revolution to counter-insurgency. I begin by stating that the war that the French army fought in colonized Algeria between 1954 and 1962 to impede the independence of Algeria from colonial rule, which had begun in 1830, is widely regarded as the precursor of counter-insurgency operations and thereby of the rhetorical war on terror of today. But what is counterinsurgency? Counterinsurgency is defined as comprehensive civil and military, and this is exactly what I will discuss today, the combination of civil and military efforts taken to simultaneously defeat and contain insurgency. And therefore, it is not a war between two or more armies on a defined battlefield, but rather a war that invades the spaces of civil life and activities, that is to say, our spaces, the spaces of civilians. The practices and theories of what we call today counterinsurgency were originally developed by French officers in Algeria, who had gained their practical experiences during the Second World War, 1939 to 1945, and during the First Indo-China War from 1946 to 1954. That is to say, Second World War, Vichy and fascist regimes. We should keep this in our minds. And the Indochina War, it's another colonial war. So the French army, or the French officers, tested a number of military strategies and tactiques, theorized them, and secretly transferred these methods to North and South America, notably to Argentina, to Chile, and to the United States of America, that as I will be discussing it shortly. So since the invasion of Iraq in 2003, however, the United States have overtly expressed their interests in French military practices in Algeria, notably the famous urban warfare methods of the Battle of Algiers from 1956 to 1957 that was screened in the Pentagon in 2003, and in the ways in which the French army had created, learned from, integrated, and enforced counter-insurgency measures. In my book, Architecture of Counter-Revolution, the French Army in Northern Algeria, I have attempted to discern the effects of these measures in transforming the Algerian territory and expose the intrinsic relationships between military maneuvers, political ideologies, colonial doctrines, and built environments. I have tried to show how the clearance of Algeria's shanty towns, the creation of the forbidden zones, the forced displacements of millions of Algerian citizens or civilians, the creation of a new fortified capital city have served military purposes of counter-revolution. The book reveals the political, socio-economic meanings of laws, maps, structures, infrastructures, shelters, housing, and other buildings, and discloses how these groups and their broad network of actors embody what the psychiatrist and author Frantz Fanon, best known for his 1961 book, The Wretches of the Earth, had called The Psychology of Colonialism. Today, I will not talk about built environment, but rather about the genealogies and ramifications of some of these counter-revolutionaries / counter-insurgency theories and practices, as well as their dissemination in the USA during and after the Algerian Revolution. I will scrutinize the scholarship of French military officer David Galula at Harvard University in 1960s and demystifies the Battle of Algiers, or its screening at the Pentagon, a few months after the invasion of Iraq. I will show how today's counterinsurgency is deeply and exceedingly rooted in colonial practices of the 19th and the 20th century. The case of the French army in colonized Algeria is a paradigm. It is not an example among many other colonies, departments, territories, and protectorates of the French First and Second Empires. Algeria was technically considered a French territory, forming France's 10th military region and administered like other French metropolitan areas, that is to say, like France. The war that the French military authorities fought in Algeria to impede the independence of Algeria from France was waged against the tumultuous backdrop of the Cold War. It was not only a war between French officers and the Algerian Armée de Libération Nationale, ALN, or National Liberation Army, the army wing of the Algerian Front de la Libération Nationale, FLN, or National Liberation Front. It was also a conflict between the French civil and military authorities, among French army officers, between the French left and right, between French communists and leftists, between French Gaullists and right-wing parties, between the Eastern and the Western blocs, and among Algerian elites. Following the outbreak of the Algerian Revolution, the United Nations General Assembly debated the Algerian question a number of times before the members of the United Nations the members of the United Nations recognized Algeria's right to self-determination, that is to say, to independence, in December 1960. The war started in 1954. The French authorities formally recognized the term war only 37 years after the ceasefire in 1962. It was not until 18 October 1999, under the presidency of Jacques Chirac, that the French authority approved the use of the official appellation La Guerre d'Algérie, the Algerian War, alternately translated the War for Algeria, at French institutions and schools and in official terminology. Before 1999, the French government euphemistically called the unnamed or undeclared war les opérations de maintien de l'ordre, the enforcement of law and order, or les événements d'Algérie, Algeria's events. Besides this appellation, this contested war bore other names: the Algerian Revolution for the Algerian people, the Algerian question for the United Nations General Assembly, colonial warfare for military historians, the dirty war for a number of French left-wing intellectuals in the 60s, modern warfare, irregular warfare, subversive warfare, psychological warfare, and counter-revolution for French army officers, and counter-insurgency operation for the US Army. Between brackets, the term revolution was replaced by insurgency in order to not acknowledge the possibility of the overthrow of a given government of power. This armed conflict was not the first war in Algeria's colonial history, but it was certainly the one that ended 132 years of French colonization of Algeria. It provoked the downfall of a number of French governments. It caused the collapse of the French Fourth Republic, led to the return of General Charles de Gaulle to power, instigated 2 French military putsches in Algiers, and for many, it was even about to initiate a French civil war. During the 8 years of the violent armed conflict, the number of French chief executives attempted to deal with the Algerian question, including Pierre Mendès France, François Mitterrand, Edgar Faure, Guy Mollet, Maurice Bourget-Monory, Félix Guillard, and Georges Pompidou. It's very important to name these people because of the complexity and the continuation of colonial rules even after the Algerian independence. Deserving of special mention is General Charles de Gaulle, who not only served as Prime Minister, Minister of Defense, and Minister of the Algerian Affairs between June 1958 and January 1959, but also as the President of the French Fifth Republic, that is to say, the Fifth Republic, the Constitution of the Fifth Republic was written in 1958, and it's still in use today. So he was a president for more than 10 years, from January 1959 to April 1969, which means that de Gaulle dictated the policies of the so-called cooperation after Algeria gained its independence from France. To understand how these counter-revolutionary measures functioned and operated, I will describe how the French military authorities conceived a set of systematic practices in what they considered to be one of the most uncontrollable and infamous areas, namely the vast highlands of the Aurès mountains in northeastern Algeria. The Aurès served as a testing ground for various civil and military counter-revolutionary operations. The inhabitants of the Aurès, the Algerian Berber-speaking Shawiya people, were a constant source of unrest for the French authorities by reason of their enduring resistance to French colonization. According to a military survey that was written and circulated by the French army during the Algerian Revolution on the physical, economic, and human geographies on the vast rural region of the Aurès, the Shawiya population had rebelled against the French in 1849, and from 1858 to 1859, in 1879, and again from 1916 to 1920. The tough climate and the rugged topography made the region almost impenetrable to the French authorities. As the military analysis stated, both the communication systems and the territorial administration reinforced the rural, tribal populace predisposition to govern itself and to defend itself from any possible external aggressor, in this case, French colonizers. In order to penetrate, to borrow a French military technical term, the Algerian population in the Aurès and elsewhere in Algeria and in France, the French National Assembly and the Council of the French Republic approved a law on the état d'urgence, state of emergency, on April 3, 1955. Between brackets, the text of the state of emergency that was approved in 1955 was reactivated by the French government in November 2015 in the aftermath of the Paris attacks. Under the law of 1955, the state of emergency could be decreed in all or parts of the metropolitan territory of France, French Algeria, or any other overseas French department in case of imminent danger resulting from serious breaches of public order or any event that by their nature or its nature and severity heralded a public calamity. The law treated the territory of France and colonized Algeria alike. The same legislation was applicable both in colonized Algeria and in France. The territories on which a state of emergency could be imposed simply needed to be designated by an official decree signed by the Council of Ministers after consulting a report on the specific situation written by the Minister of the Interior, who was at that time François Mitterrand. The first territories to be placed under a state of emergency were neither located in metropolitan France nor in a French colony or protectorate, but rather it was located in French colonized Algeria. On 6 April 1955, a state of emergency was imposed on the arrondissement of Betna, on the Aurès, Tizi Ouzou, as well as on the municipality of Tebessa. On 6 April 1955, the law of state of emergency of 3 days earlier was promptly enforced across the vastness of the Aurès mountains. On 12 April of the same year, that is to say 6 days later, the military cabinet of the Governor General of Algeria, Jacques Soustelle, distributed a memo titled, I quote, La pacification de l'Aurès, between brackets, or the translation is the pacification of the Aurès, specifying that, I quote, the recovery of the situation in the Aurès or in the area where the state of emergency is enforced will be achieved by means of the policy of pacification, end of quote. The term pacification, literally peacemaking, although the reality entails something else or completely different, was not a new term in the glossary of the French army. Pacification had been employed in the 19th century during the long years of the wars of the French colonization of Algeria, as well as of other territories in Africa and Southeast Asia, such as Tonkin and Madagascar. But the French monarchy has also used the same word during the 16th century, for instance, during the European wars of religion. Although the expression itself remained largely unchanged, the policies, methods, and technologies of pacification were considerably reorganized and had been gradually upgraded to match the conditions of the 20th century, especially following the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War. That is to say, the term pacification was used before counter-revolution and before counterinsurgency, as I will shortly describe. During the Algerian Revolution, the Bureau Psychologique, Psychological Bureau, of the Joint High Commander released a military guide pratique de pacification, a practical guidelines for pacification, addressed to the French commanders of the companies, batteries, squadrons, and sub-districts in French colonized Algeria, and designed to instruct the officers under their authority. The text on the different methods used to forge the instruments of pacification reported that, I quote, "It means making clear to every soldier that he must provide, in addition to a purely military action, a psychological action that is no less important and that is exerted by human contacts." This recommendation meant that pacification encompassed targeting the Algerian population for both military and social psychological action, and that every soldier should become, according to the guideline, an agent of pacification. Another military document drawn up in 1957, that is during the Battle of Algiers, a meticulous study entitled Études sur les problèmes et les méthodes de pacification en Algérie, a survey on the problems and methods of pacification in Algeria, asserted that pacification should more energetically promote three activities: direct contact with the population, the initiation of construction sites, and that is where an architecture historian as myself is interested, so the initiation of construction sites, what kind of construction sites, and the third activity is the spread of education. The military survey was based on an in-depth questionnaire filled out by French soldiers who were serving in French colonial Algeria and who had directly experienced both the shortcoming and the strength of the methods of pacification. However, these methods had in fact taken on perverse forms of civil military operations, influenced by a number of French officers who, having already served in two previous wars, as I mentioned earlier, the Second World War and the First Indochina War, were now serving in a third war, namely the Algerian Revolution or the Algerian counter-revolution. These officers were notorious theorists and advocates of the doctrine of the guerre moderne, also known, as mentioned earlier, as guerre révolutionnaire, revolutionary warfare. Its counterpart, the guerre contre-révolutionnaire, counter-revolutionary warfare, or counter-insurgency of today, was France's war of pacification waged in Algeria. Among the leading theorists and practitioners of counter-revolutionary, so of pacification / counter-revolution / counter-insurgency in colonial Algeria, some of whom were also well known for their roles in the brutal Battle of Algiers, were Colonels Marcel Bijard, David Galula, Yves Godard, Charles Lacheroy, Roger Trinquier, and Generals Paul Ossares, Jacques Massu, and Raoul Salan. I'm mentioning them because we will hear some of their witnesses later on. Salan, the last one that I just mentioned, was France's most decorated soldier at the time. In January 1961, he founded a paramilitary extremist group known as the Organisation de l'Armée Secrète, OAS, the secret army organization which violently opposed the Algerian independence. On 2 July 1957, Colonel Lacheroy, head of the Service de l'Information et de l'Action Psychologique, so the Service of Psychological Action and Intelligence, at the French Ministry of National Defense, delivered a lecture to an audience of 2,000 officers in the auditorium of the Sorbonne in Paris, entitled La guerre révolutionnaire et l'arme psychologique, Revolutionary Warfare and Psychological Weaponry. The colonel, who was later sent to Constantine in Algeria and then to Algiers, drew particular attention to the radically distinct character of this type of warfare, which consisted of, as he named it, total warfare. He argued that total, because not only does it mobilize in this effort all of the industrial, commercial, and agricultural powers of a country, but it also takes up in the war effort all women and children and elderly men, all who think, all who live, all who breathe, with all their forces of love, all their forces of enthusiasm, all their forces of hate, and it throws them into war. This is the new reality. Total war, because it takes the souls as well as the bodies, and it yields them to the obedience of the war effort. End of quote. Following the same line of thought, Colonel Trinquier, who himself both recommended and encouraged the use of torture, claimed in his 1961 book, La Guerre Moderne, that, I quote, "The sine qua non of victory in modern warfare is the unconditional support of a population. According to Mao Zedong, it is an essential to the combated as water to the fish. Such support may be spontaneous, although that is quite rare, thank God, and probably a temporary condition. If it does not exist, it must be secured by every possible means, the most effective of which is terrorism." End of quote. Colonel Galula is well known to English-speaking military strategists and readers since he published 2 manuals in English, Counterinsurgency Warfare Theory and Practice in 1964 and Pacification in Algeria in 1963, as he was a research associate at Harvard University Center for International Affairs between 1962 and 1967. Galula was, before his appointment at Harvard, logically or obviously an officer in Algeria. Galula noted that, I quote, "Pacification would be achieved if we could gradually compromise the population in the eyes of the rebels." The rebels in this case were Algerian liberation fighters. The rebels of today, I leave it to you, or we can discuss about it in the Q&A later. Colonel Galula's 1964 monograph on the theory and practice of counter-revolution warfare influenced the US military thinking and practices, including as late as 2006 in the Department of the US Army Field Manual FM 324 entitled Counterinsurgency. This manual was addressed to US soldiers fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. As noted in its foreword, the manual was meant to fill a doctrinal gap of 20 years. Colonel Galula's thinking was frequently cited in the manual's second chapter, entitled Unity of Effort, Integrating Civil and Military Activities. Notably, his argument that in this type of war, I quote Galula from the counterinsurgency manual, from the US counterinsurgency manual, Galula saying, "The soldier must be prepared to become a social worker, a civil engineer," that is again where my role as historian of architecture becomes relevant. I mean, if we talk about civil engineers, and a school teacher, a nurse, a Boy Scout. But only for as long as he cannot be replaced, for it is better to entrust civilians' tasks to civilians. End of quote. In colonized Algeria and in other geographies, the soldier was not replaced. The French journalist Marie-Monique Robin masterfully interviewed those officers who were still alive in 2003. The interviews formed the basis of her book Les Escadrons de la Mort, l'École Française, The Death Squads, the French School, also used in her documentary film with the same title. The film and the book detail both the methods of war applied by the protagonists and the exports of these methods to North and South America, notably, as I mentioned before, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and the United States of America. We will watch a few minutes from this film as she is interviewing directly the officers, and I think their accounts are much more relevant to listen to than me quoting them. The sound it was working before. Maybe he did something like this. Go back. PC. Where is this person? He's not here. No, but where is he? We cannot call him.
It's not working now.
No. We cannot call him.
Okay. So we're just trying to find somebody who knows how to turn the sound on.
But we tried before, it was working, yes.
Was it just here?
Yeah, he just did this. But I think environment, DVD laptop. No, let's do this. And then check again. No.
What? It is on.
It's on. We cannot call him, eh? He went.
She's trying to.
Pardon. Okay, let's do maybe. How can I do it maybe from? Yes? There is no sound.
Anti-subversive war.
What did you do?
I just went into
Oh,
the
thank you.
Is it working now?
Yes.
The Panamanian School of the Americas.
you.
This
La tortura y los asesinatos de forma ilegal.
The Panamanian School of the Americas. This name is still associated with the history of Latin American dictatorships. Created in 1946 in the United States, the school specializes in anti-subversive warfare in the mid-60s. Thus, in the name of the fight against communism, 60,000 Latin American officers are trained in what was called the School of the Dictators. This fact is well known, but what is less well known is the role the French played in the training of the American instructors. It all began in 1960 when Pierre Mesmer was appointed Minister of Defense. He was contacted by the Americans at the time when the Vietnam War was building up.
C'est toute la théorie de la guerre révolutionnaire qui les a intéressés.
Vous, en tant que ministre, vous avez reçu des demandes d'envoi d'instructeurs.
Ils l'ont demandé, nous avons donné suite à leurs demandes.
Et quel était le profil de ces militaires que vous avez envoyés là-bas, aux États-Unis?
On s'efforçait d'envoyer des gens qui avaient l'expérience. C'était une question d'expérience surtout.
Et Ossares, comment est-il devenu instructeur à Fort Bragg?
Il est devenu instructeur à Fort Bragg parce que c'était un spécialiste. Quand les Américains ont demandé des conseillers techniques, je suppose que l'état-major de l'armée a dû prendre ces listes et désigner des hommes qui avaient appartenu aux états-majors en Algérie, et en particulier qui avait eu ses missions d'interrogation des prisonniers, etc.
Et Ossarès était l'un des meilleurs spécialistes de la guerre révolutionnaire. Enfin, pour la France, en tout cas.
Oui, Ossarès, je crois, n'est pas un penseur. Je crois que c'est un exécutant.
In 1961, Major Ossarès is appointed to work under the military attaché at the French embassy in Washington, to whom 10 liaison officers report. All of them are veterans from the war in Algeria, dispatched among the different American military academies. Ossarès is sent to Fort Bragg, the headquarters of the special forces that intervened massively in Vietnam.
Qu'est-ce que vous avez donc enseigné là-bas?
Eh bien, j'ai enseigné les conditions dans lesquelles j'ai fait un travail qui n'était pas celui que fait normalement une armée classique.
En clair, vous avez enseigné les techniques de la bataille d'Alger.
C'est ça.
C'est-à-dire
Voilà.
aussi bien les arrestations, le renseignement, la torture, tout ça.
Tout ça.
The United States. General Johns and Colonel Bernard are two former students who studied under Ossarès at Fort Bragg. Vietnam veterans, today they are active campaigners against the use of torture. They confirm that at the beginning of the 60s they had never heard of anti-subversive warfare.
At that time, you considered that French had more experiences in counterinsurgency, for instance, than American people?
Oh, there's no question about it. We had no experience in this. We called in people from France. We read their books. We read the experiences there to try to learn as much as possible.
What kind of books, for instance, did you read?
The Tranquier's book. Now, we got Tranquier's, La Guerre Moderne. We got this at Fort Bragg in 1961 in draft. And Paul Ossarès, it was sent to him. He had worked for Tranquier, and we went over it in detail. And I was one of the folk who explained what later became the Phoenix program. We drew it from that book. We sent it up to Bob Comer, who was in the White House at the time.
Robert Comer. This CIA agent was appointed at the head of the Saigon branch in 1967. In charge of a death squad, he was entrusted with the elimination of the Viet Cong networks amongst the Vietnamese population. A very dirty operation christened Operation Phoenix.
The same sort of thing, the Battle of Alger. And the result were, tragic is a gentle term. Now, the numbers that are used, evidently 20,000 people
Killed.
were killed, yes,
Civilians.
yes.
Did Paul Ossarès speak about his role in the Battle of Alger?
What Paul was doing at Fort Bragg with us was underlining, trying to make us understand the critical aspects of intelligence, how we had acquired it, and then how we applied ourselves to exploiting the intelligence we had. Well, he explained torture. They would take a captive. Generally, they were able to persuade each of these people. Most of them spoke. Those who didn't, they put in enough pain and mortal pain that most of them spoke. And then to have one prisoner watching another one being tortured and realize he was next often made him willing to talk. The additional part of this was, what do you do with these people after they have been tortured? Authorized answer to this was that they were executed.
La plupart des élèves que vous avez eus sont partis ensuite au
Ah,
Vietnam.
ben, ils sont partis, ils sont allés au travail.
Et au
Et
Vietnam.
j'en ai retrouvé, quand j'ai été attaché militaire au Brésil après con, j'ai retrouvé des généraux qui m'ont dit « Mais on vous a eu comme instructeur à Fort Bragg.
C'était en quelle année que vous étiez au Brésil, en général?
73.
And it continues. Brazil and other places in Argentina and around the world. So if we go back to the 1955 military instruction, La pacification des arrests, the pacification of the arrests that I mentioned earlier, we see that counter-revolution undertakings were of a profound varying character. They included the organization of an extensive network of administrators and military officers who had previously operated in the Affaire Indigène, indigenous affair in the French Protectorate of Morocco. The application of significantly in-depth political and administrative actions, and the capture and destruction of the so-called rebel groups. This last military directive expressed the specific characteristics of pacification in three distinct yet interrelated operations. The human action, the use, that is to say, the use of a population or population-based actions by becoming acquainted with the population, supervising them, regaining their confidence, and obtaining their profound support. The second action was called l'action constructive, and it consisted of building new connecting roads, infrastructure, and additional administrative centers and military posts, so it's architecture and built environment, and organizing better living conditions in the Aurès. The third action was called the action de protection, which meant or entailed the use of protective actions that were meant to create a permanent environment of insecurity for the so-called rebels by A, the use of intelligence, human contact, and ambush, B, the presence and action of military forces and police controls based on intelligence and political action, C, the progressive arming of the population in order to enable its self-defense, D, the distancing of so-called suspects, and E, the use of traditional armed fighting against the so-called rebels. The term rebels, in one sense, alluded to revolutionaries or fighters for the liberation of the colonized population and territory, armed or non-armed individuals claiming Algeria's independence from France, and violent or non-violent anti-colonial militants. The word suspects, by contrast, indicated as deliberately defined in the military directive those people, I quote, who provide any personal, voluntarily, and effective assistance to the rebels, end of quote. To this end, any person, a family member, a neighbor, a friend, a colleague, or anyone else who dared to feed, treat, dress, lodge, hide, or even speak with a revolutionary liberation fighter was automatically considered a suspect and would immediately be, to use another technical term, distancié from the rest of the population. The same military directive, however, stated that during the operation of éloignement, distancing of suspects, I quote, no collective sanctions of a deportation character are acceptable, end of quote. However, since there was no apparent regulation to distinguish suspects from non-suspects, the entire Algerian population became a potential object of suspicion, an enemy who needed to be converted into an unconditional non-suspect. According to Colonel Trinquier, I quote, since it is the population that is at stake, the struggle will assume two aspects: political, that is to say, direct action on the population, and military, the struggle against the armed forces of the aggressor. This was a political aspect imposed upon the civilian population and policed and monitored by the army. The same thinking was expressed in a further military directive of December 1959 entitled Instructions pour la pacification en Algérie, Instructions for Pacification in Algeria, 5 years after the outbreak of the war and 1 year and a half after the return of General Charles de Gaulle to power in 1958. The director argued that I quote, "The population is the challenge of the adversary as well as of the law enforcement officials. The population is the key to the problem because success will belong to those who engage the population in their actions." End of quote. In the Horace, the role of the French civil authorities was to contribute to the pacification / counter-revolutionary / counter-insurgency missions of their military counterparts and to elaborate on political aspects of those missions. This situation changed when French ethnologist, Governor-General of colonized Algeria, Jacques Soustelle, decided on a drastic course of action in April 1955. With the intention of incorporating military operation into civil programs, Soustelle called for, I quote, "the creation of one single command, civil and military, for the entirety of South Constantine," end of quote, where the state of emergency, l'état d'urgence, was enforced. Soustell's categorical demand was immediately endorsed. The exceptional powers granted under the state of emergency were thus to be exercised not by a civil administrator as would be usual in a state of non-war, but rather by a military officer. Similarly to the state of emergency that was enforced in the Horace and later throughout the entirety of Algeria, this tight civil and military cooperation headed by a military officer was, according to Soustelle, first tested in the Horace and then gradually applied across large portions of Algeria between 1956 and 1958 under the banner of État-Major Mixte, Civil-Military General Staff. It reached its peak in May 1959 with General Raoul Salon, that I mentioned earlier, serving as commander of both the civil and military forces, as delegate general of the government in Algeria, commander-in-chief of the armed forces in Algeria, and as the commander of the 10th military region, that is to say, of Algeria. I mean, he had all kinds of powers. But why or how did this tight civil-military operation, again, what we call today insurgency, start? In April 1955, the president of the Council of Ministers, Edgar Faure, had signed an interministerial agreement in which he appointed General Gaston Parlanche as chief of the civil and military commander-in-chief of the Horace, Nemeshta. Prior to his arrival in Algeria, and this is where I start to elaborate on the relationship between counterinsurgency, counter-revolution, pacification, and the 19th century colonial measures. So prior to his arrival in Algeria, General Parlanche had been in charge of the indigenous affairs in the French Protectorate of Morocco. He was trained in the colonial doctrines and methods of Marshal Louis Lyotet, which I will discuss shortly. According to Soustelle, Parlanche's previous involvement in the pacification of Morocco, his comprehensive knowledge of Berber language, which is very important, knowing the language and society, his responsive authority, and his friendly character all made him the best candidate for the restoration of civil military law and order in the Horace. His twofold mission particularly included the direct participation of both military officers and civil administrators serving under his command. He argued the development of educational and social services, healthcare assistance, and the launching of construction sites for public works in order to address unemployment, poverty, and underemployment. The civil-military directive was officially endorsed in a signed agreement by Edgar Faure. So he's the fourth ministry and his Minister of the Interior, Maurice Bourget-Monory, and fourth Minister of National Defense and Armed Forces, General Pierre Koenig. This type or types of socio-economic missions, special commissions, and political assignments, all of them non-military in nature, had already formed an integral part of Marshal Lyotet's military colonial school in the 19th century. In his first influential article on the social role of the officers and the universal military service from 1891, Lyautey criticized the rigidity and inadequacy of French military education. He claimed that French military schools should provide, I quote, a fruitful conception of the modern role of the officer in order to become an educator of the entire nation. He also argued that it was necessary to transform the deleterious facets of war into beneficial authorities and thereby to, I quote, display during the course of military service not only violent and sterile fatigue, but also the broader field of social action. Marcel Lyautey, renowned, has often centered on his published letters and military colonial techniques, as well as, and here I talk to the historians of architecture who are present here in the room, as well as on the special planning proposals and principles that he developed in Morocco together with the French architect and town planner Henri Prost during Lyautey's mandate as the first resident general in the newly designated Protectorate of Morocco between 1912 and 1924. Nevertheless, Lyautey's methods had in fact progressively developed prior to the French colonization of Morocco. His colonial mindset originated from his previous military experiences and was informed by influential French military officers and colonial administrators, including Marshal Joseph Gallieni in French colonial Indochina and Marshal Thomas Bugeaud in French colonial Algeria. Lyautey graduated from the École Spéciale Militaire of Saint-Cyr in 1875. 2 years later, he was promoted to lieutenant. Immediately after his promotion, he traveled to French colonial Algeria, where he spent his promotion leave and wrote his unpublished Notes d'Algérie. Based on a lottery draw, he was assigned to the cavalry in the 2nd Hussar Regiment, with which he returned to Algeria from 1880 to 1882. There he learned the Arabic language, which is very important, and wrote his unpublished Lettres d'Algérie. His years in the French colonial departments of Algeria provided him with the learning about the strong Algerian resistance that the French army faced, in particular as embodied in Marshal Bugeaud's bloody battle against Emir Abdelkader and his forces, which led to Bugeaud becoming Governor General of Algeria. In 1841, Bugeaud established the Direction des Affaires Arabes, the Bureau of Arab Affairs, which was directly subordinated to the military authorities. And the permanent role of this office was, I quote, to ensure the lasting pacification of tribes by means of a fair and orderly administration in order to pave the way for our colonization, to ensure our trade through the enforcement of public security, and to ensure the protection of all legitimate interests and advances in the well-being of the so-called indigenous population. Following his first colonial experiences in French colonial Algeria, Lyautey was promoted to captain and sent first to Italy and then back to France. In 1894, at the age of 40, he was assigned to the general staff of the French troops in Indochina, where he fought alongside Colonel Gallieni in the Tonkin, where Gallieni became Governor General of Madagascar in 1897. This is extremely important because we see all these traveling and complexities of the backgrounds of these officers. So he asked Lyautey to follow him and assigned him to important positions in the processes of pacification / counter-revolutionary operations on the island, after which Lyautey was promoted to lieutenant colonel. In his second key essay on the colonial role of the army, which he published in 1900, the newly promoted Colonel Lyautey discussed his brand of the art of the colonial warfare and the military strategies of pacification. According to Lyautey, the preeminent means for achieving pacification, as his tutor Gallieni had claimed in 1898, now quoted in Lyautey's article, was, I quote, to employ a combined action of power and politics. Here we are in the 19th century. Yeah? Lyautey followed Gallieni causality. I quote, "Whenever incidents of war require one of our colonial officers to act against a village or an inhabited center, he should not lose sight of its primary attention once the subjugation of the inhabitant is obtained, which is to rebuild the village, create a market, and establish a school." End of quote. To this end, the civil military duties of French officers in colonized Algeria, and by extension of US officers in Iraq, in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, included the reconstruction, and again, this is where architects are involved, of a village that they themselves destroyed. This is what Lyautey had called the social role of the officer, and what Trinquier and Galula has called the political and psychological action. An action that was expected to be applied to the totality of the civilian population. Trinquier claimed that, I quote, "the control of the masses through a tight organization, often through several parallel organizations, is the master weapon of modern warfare." End of quote. This French colonial school of warfare, developed by Bugeaud in French colonial Algeria, refined by Gallieni in French colony of Madagascar, transmitted by Lyautey into the French Protectorate of Morocco, re-engineered by Soustelle in French colonial Algeria, applied by Parlange in the Aurès, extensively practiced and theorized by Trinquier and Galula, Galula among many others, and exported to the USA, Argentina, and other countries, promoted the application of social, special practices and psycho-political functions by military officers. In 2014, the Department of the US Army issued the second version of the manual, FM 324. This time, it was titled Insurgencies and Countering Insurgencies. Surprisingly, references to David Galula and to other French colonial modern warfare theories and practices and protagonists have completely disappeared from the manual of 2014. However, the content of the manual didn't change much, and the unquoted, unreferenced French deeds in colonized Algeria are still present in the manual in other countries. I would like to conclude by stressing that the terms pacification, counter-revolution, counterinsurgency, social action belong to what Roland Barthes, French literary theorist and linguist, has called écriture cosmétique, cosmetic writing, a writing whose scope was not to communicate, but rather to intimidate. In the chapter titled Grammaire africaine, African Grammar, or African Grammar, in his 1957 book, Mythologies, a book published during the Algerian Revolution, Barthes argued that the official terminology that the French representatives used during the Algerian War belonged to this semantic category, a mask that was designed to divert attention from the nature of war and cover the real facts with the noise of language. According to Barthes, this grammar was both ideologically burdened and politically loaded. In this context, he defined the term war as follows, and this is my last quote: war, the aim is to deny the thing. For there are two ways: either to name it as little as possible, the most common method, or to give it the meanings of its own antonym, a more devious method, which is the basic for almost all the mystification or the mystifications of bourgeois language. War is then used in the sense of peace, and pacification in the sense of war. Thank you very much for your attention.